have a lot to cover, and we have members of the public here. So why don't we, this is a meeting of the Climate Action Committee, and why don't, I'll call it to order, and why don't you do the roll call?
Is everyone's microphones on? If you guys could,
Yes?
Testing.
hello?
Testing. Test. Yes.
Hello? Yeah.
If there's not a
red.
red light, then you can, there's a switch on the bottom. Okay, looks like they're on.
Red light
Great.
is on, is that right?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yes. Roll call. Committee member Cooper said he has to come about an hour late. Committee member Larson.
Here.
Committee member Martin.
Here.
Committee member Sear is not here yet. Committee member, or Vice Chair Smithies.
Here.
Committee member Way.
Here.
And Chair Peterson.
Here. Okay, so we had 2 minutes to approve. It looks like that we came through. I looked through both of them. I do not have any comments on them. Does anybody else have any comments on the meeting minutes? Looks like you picked up the comment I had last time, so I'm totally okay with it. Any comments? Okay, I make a motion, we approve the minutes.
I'll second that.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. Oh,
Oh, Tom's
Here.
not late.
wow, good.
The motion was for both the December 5th and February 20th minutes. That's what I got.
Right, for both of them. Tom, you didn't have any comments on the minutes from the last meeting? Okay, great. Well, that's good. So we're already ahead of schedule. So I wanted to, now, when I open it for public comment, just trying to, can people bring up issues that aren't on the agenda?
That's the purpose of this public
Yeah,
comment,
okay,
is for
so-
items that aren't on the agenda.
Right, so we have pretty full agenda today. If people want to come up and make comments relative to something that's not on the agenda, this is a time to do it. But if you have something that's on the agenda, we will cover it when we get there. So any public comment? Okay, well, that's good. And that puts us even more ahead, which is good. So why don't we do announcements?
All right. Quick announcement on sustainability events. East Bay Community Energy held an Understand Your Bill event a couple weeks ago. Chair Peterson was there, so was I. I thought it went pretty well. Some genuine interest in the program, and people, I think, got their bill questions answered. What I learned is that electricity bills are immensely complicated. And if anyone has any questions, Dan Lieberman is great at explaining it. So tonight, Albany Film Fest is holding their Our Beautiful Planet Home environmentally themed films at the Albany Twin at the exact time of your meeting from 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. This has been an issue for the past couple of years, and we actually requested specifically that they hold it at a different time because they've invited committee members and staff in the past to speak. And unfortunately, they weren't able to have a different time because their sponsor, the Park District, had asked specifically for this date. So they're aware of the conflict, and next year I'll reach out to them earlier and make sure that it doesn't happen again. But it sounds like a great event. Also, make sure to turn off your lights and opt outside for Earth Hour 2019, which is on Saturday, March 30th at 8:30 p.m. And those are the sustainability events happening in the next month or so.
I have one to add that's at your seat, a little postcard about an upcoming Alameda County Transportation Commission meeting on April 4th here to introduce to the community a planning process they're working on for San Pablo Avenue, the entire corridor of San Pablo Avenue from Oakland up to wherever it ends, I guess, in Pinole or San Pablo. Anyhow, this is introducing the possibility of improving transit service, and it's very complex, lots of trade-offs about how to improve transit service that impact parking and bicycle facilities and the urban design feel of the street. So this is, if it's something that you might be interested in, I encourage you to attend on April 4th.
Okay, great. Any- No.
No, it introduces potential for bus rapid transit, which is a significant improvement to transit service, but also a significant impact on the design of the street.
Are we ready to move on?
Okay, any other announcements or anything? Why don't we go on to the next, the carbon-free Albany update?
So for Carbon Free Albany, we are still trying to get people to sign up. The site, Community Climate Solutions, was supposed to launch their new platform features. They're changing the back end of the platform so that it more closely mimics Netflix and Yelp, so that it's a little bit more user-friendly and eye-catching. And also it has some great features where you can do a better job of getting community groups on board because they're able to create their own page that they can use to access their members and start conversations. And so those updates were supposed to go live last Friday, but then we got an email from Lisa that they have been postponed. She said sometime middle of this week. I haven't heard anything since last Friday, but I have a few plans to do some more outreach to community groups once those site updates go live. And I know our outreach subcommittee is also working on some outreach opportunities. So hopefully we see our numbers start to shoot up soon.
Good, good. Yeah, I mean, that's an important thing to get out and publicize. Okay, so any comments on that? Does the public want to make any comments on anything that's been raised so far? No? Okay, let's move on to presentation. And I think, are you ready to go? Okay. So we're going to, this is on green infrastructure, right? Yeah. The committee's been discussing how green infrastructure impacts on the climate action plan, so we asked for clarification on exactly what is meant by green infrastructure. So yeah, so Member Sear is going to give us a explanation, right?
Do you have a sense of how long?
Well, I had put, I mean, you got plenty of time now because I had put that this would go through till about 8:10. So if we can beat that, that would be nice because I.
How many minutes?
Well, right now that looks like it'd be 30 minutes.
Oh, okay. I can adjust the time as needed. Okay. All right. Thank you, and good evening to everyone who's joining us on climate action. So as we've been working with a consultant to develop the city's climate action plan, questions came up around the idea of green infrastructure and just what is that and how can that help us as we're seeking to be carbon neutral and a happy city. So 4 points that I'd like the committee to wrap their heads around and the public to join in. That first, when we're thinking of green infrastructure, what we're really talking about are living systems. So I want us to not only think very narrowly and specifically about how many tons of CO2 does each measure save, but to really think about how do we function as a city with ecology, with living systems. And I'll be giving some examples of this. But the reason we want to think systemically is that these living systems, whether they're a network of trees or rainwater gardens that channel stormwater, that these have multiple benefits, not only for the climate action plan, but for the quality of life in the city. So it's helpful to think of what are the essential city services that are provided to us, and how can these living systems help provide those services, sometimes with less cost, and often with much greater appeal. So you can think of green infrastructure in contrast to gray infrastructure, which is using concrete and mechanical systems. So I think you're aware there's been a big movement in the area to free creeks. In other words, a lot of our waterways had been channelized and put in concrete culverts, and this totally disrupts our connection with natural hydrological flow. It disrupts the ecology, and often end up covered in litter and graffiti. So these green systems are a way of providing flood management or dealing with drought, dealing with the climate impacts we face in a living way. Then we do have, because this is the Climate Action Committee, we have to get really specific about how do these green infrastructure systems help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How do they help us get to carbon neutral? But also, how do they help us deal with impacts of climate change? How can they do both? So I wanted to bring to you a quote from one of the great thinkers and urban planners of American society, from Jane Jacobs, who really observed cities and how people live in them. And she puts in her cheer for diversity and this idea of regeneration of a living city. So if we think about that in terms of climate action, and how can we have a low carbon or carbon neutral city and one that's resilient to droughts and storms and sea level rise and fires and all the other horrible impacts of climate change? Just a few specifics. When we're talking low carbon, we're talking about a climate-friendly system, bringing down greenhouse gases to at least 80% below present levels, and we'll be talking later this evening about carbon neutral and what that means. But the idea is we have to get back in balance with the climate system, right? So whether we're planting trees or doing stormwater management with living systems, they can help us rebalance that system. And they often have better resilience than mechanical, sort of fixed system infrastructure, because they're more adaptable. And that idea of resilience means we can prepare, absorb, recover from, adapt to disruptions. Another way of saying it is we can survive and thrive. That's the idea. And before I give other specific examples of green infrastructure, I just want to get us also thinking about where are we in the planning process and the action process for our climate plan, and how does the emissions reduction connect with the adaptation or resilience? So in the past, in the first climate action plan, we went through these steps of, we had commitment of the leadership, an energy and carbon inventory, we set targets, we chose strategies, we've been implementing them, we've been evaluating how they're doing, and now we're going around again. in 2.0 Climate Action Plan. And this time, we're also including the steps in orange, which are about adaptation, also known as resilience. So we're looking at what are our issues, what impacts are we facing, how can we be prepared, we can set goals, make our plan, and implement those same steps. Okay. And in addition to being a member of the Climate Action Committee, I also do my day job is focused on research and education around climate and energy. And in the work I've done, looking in the US and internationally, there are some common kinds of responses to adapt to impacts of climate change. And one of them that is highlighted is the use of natural systems. In other words, green infrastructure, blue-green infrastructure, dealing with living things and water. So Albany is in good company with what we're doing on this. Okay, now a few examples. These are kind of tiny graphics, but just to give you a few more examples, what do we mean by blue-green infrastructure? The ones in green have some kind of vegetation. So we can have a more extensive collection of trees in a carbon forest, and those trees, as they're growing, can uptake carbon, sequester carbon. It may not be as large of an amount of carbon as we are getting from our 100% renewable electricity with East Bay Community Energy, but the vegetation does add that benefit. This next example of blue-green infrastructure is as a buffer. So another benefit is improved air quality, where trees or thicker vegetation can intercept particulate matter. They can even process some other air pollutants and just physically give a buffer. So that's another benefit. Then I've got a number of examples that focus more on the blue, the water aspect of a living infrastructure. So most of those have to do with stormwater and water retention. I don't know if you heard the news recently about LA, as they're also grappling with drought. They're reconfiguring some vacant land to really capture any rainfall and recharge it to the aquifers, as well as prevent flooding. So we can use what's called a stormwater boulevard, where we use soils and plants following, like alongside a roadway, to intercept the water and help send it back down into the ground. I mean, we don't get hit by the same kinds of storms as other parts of the country do, but we have been having more flooding, even this winter. So these kind of retention ponds, surface lakes, where even parks can be reconfigured with their grading so that when there's a big storm, they'll capture and kind of hold water. And when there's not a storm, we can play in it. So good multi-purpose infrastructure. All right. And there's variations on the size of these, whether it's an infiltration pool or more dispersed ponds. And for comparison, all of these examples I'm showing are being used in Detroit, in part to save money, because the mechanical systems, the size of them no longer matches the population. So with these kinds of living systems, they could more cheaply manage the stormwater, and it adds to the appeal in the community. One thing we have that they don't have is bayfront property. So there is also opportunity to do some blue-green infrastructure along coast, either for carbon absorption, but also as buffer against storm surge. Okay, a few more ideas. On the social side, green infrastructure can be, if it's placed right, can actually address inequities and provide, sort of expand the services to all communities. So this idea of equity coming in. Just a couple other notes from Detroit around that. I think we've hit on most of them. Cleansing stormwater, improving air quality, recreation opportunities, but also habitat. I mean, even though with Climate Action Plan, we're thinking about emissions and equipment and cars and furnaces, but we're doing all this to keep a living environment, and green infrastructure done well can improve habitat and create enhanced ecological diversity. You have to get the trees right and the vegetation right, but it also has that benefit. Here's one other climate impact that green infrastructure can help with. Heat. So even though we have a very lovely temperate climate, we are getting more hot days and extremely hot days. I know I felt it in being on the third floor, top floor of an apartment where we don't have greatly designed airflow. It can really heat up. And all the beautiful trees in Albany add that shading, which they can shade buildings, and that saves energy for cooling. In the winter, they can provide buffers against the winds, which saves energy for heating. And there are analyses out there that quantify this, in different parts of the country that we can draw on for our plan. Okay, this graphic is a little fuzzy, but I just want to give you this other main concept idea, which is that living systems, green infrastructure accomplish multiple things, and therefore they're more resilient than mono infrastructure that is in concrete for one purpose and one purpose only. And that's where cities in many places, Portland, New York, other California cities have found, if we think about all the services we need to provide and how can we provide them together, green infrastructure can really help. For example, your trees or other greenery can be a buffer, which we have along BART. And as somebody who lives close to BART, I appreciate that there are trees kind of in between me and the sound and the dust. And that encourages active transport, which is another agenda item for today, right? About how do we encourage biking and walking and public transit and still get to use other vehicles as needed. So if you've ever waited for a bus surrounded by concrete when there's a lot of wind or rain, you know it's not a pleasant experience, and it discourages you from wanting to do that. Whereas if you're waiting for the bus and there's trees and there's vegetation, it feels very different. And this can be used at fairly large scale. So again, I was recently doing research in Detroit, so that's why all my examples are from there. But they actually stopped building an underground stormwater drainage tunnel that was really costly and developed this integrated network of rain gardens and parks and green roofs to manage that. Okay, just one or two more slides and I can stop and we can talk about it. So bringing this back around to our climate action plan and how it connects, I wanted to share the example of what do we do with our rooftops. We can do a lot of things on our rooftops. I mean, if you think about it, that's a lot of space in the city. And not all of them can handle a lot of weight, but we have options. So we could do cool roofs just with pigment and paint or in roofing materials that better reflects infrared and helps to cool the buildings. We can do green roofs where we have soil and vegetation. Not only can that create habitat for humans and non-humans, being on the third floor of an apartment building, I can often see people who have rooftop access and what they do up there, and it's a nice, another layer of living. In addition to that, we can help pollinators by doing right plantings on green roofs. They also insulate. Good insulation and filter air pollutants. Then if you incorporate the water management with blue roofs, you can gather the storm water and channel it appropriately, even recover it maybe. And finally, you could also put solar PV or solar water heating or even a mini wind turbine. I haven't seen any in Albany, but that's also an option. We can skip the food part, and then I'll just wrap up by saying what we're getting at here with blue-green infrastructure are more ways of getting to carbon neutral, helping us deal with impacts of climate change, making it a better social space, and when it's a good social space and all of our city services are functioning, then it's good for the economy too. All right, with that, I'd love to hear any questions or discussion.
Yeah, so why don't, let's start with the committee here, and then we'll open up for public comment. Anybody have any comments on this?
That was great, Stephanie. Thank you for putting this together. What does your research show about the pros and cons of planting trees in an urban setting versus what's required to maintain them? Versus the
maintenance costs.
The watering and all that kind of thing, juxtapose the carbon sequestration.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I don't have like an economic analysis here for you tonight. I know whether or not this is done for the climate plan or for general purposes in the city, you're right, there is maintenance involved, and there's always the challenge of trees and sidewalks and managing that. But, I mean, it's commonly done, and the alternative of not having the trees, I think, is generally much worse. I'm sorry, I don't have specific economic numbers.
Yeah, no, I wasn't suggesting trees are a bad thing. It's just that that's something we need to take into account, that it takes water, and plus, maintenance and impact to them. Not that trees are bad, but that's part of the equation, is we're in a drought, and if we're planting more things that require water, you have to have the right kind of tree that can adapt to the climate that we're in and will be in the future.
Right. And I do know some cities that have done creative things with community engagement around care and maintenance.
Any other comments? I'll have my comments last, but does anybody else?
Yeah.
I just had a question. Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing that with us. I was wondering, from the climate standpoint, would you have a prioritization of efforts or measures or items which might have the largest impacts? Like maybe it's the cool roofs, perhaps, or cool pavements. But I was just wondering, from your perspective, and knowing Albany is, not exactly Detroit, but small city, flattish, mild climate,
Yeah, I don't have the final analysis, but I think that this is part of the climate action planning where we can take those considerations and do that prioritization for Albany. I think that's what we're in the midst of.
Yeah.
Has there been any move made by the city or any organizations, maybe not necessarily affiliated with the city, to encourage any of the things mentioned on your slides so far?
I wonder, Claire, do you have a...
we have some green infrastructure projects, so we've incorporated rain gardens in the past. We have an urban forestry program. And what we're talking about now is sort of how do we expand on those kind of existing things, especially the things that have been successful, and think kind of strategically and long term about how we incorporate more blue-green infrastructure. It's interesting you mentioned creeks too. We've done lots of creek restoration projects in the past here as well.
Great.
Thanks, that was really nice, thanks. On the stormwater management kind of stuff, if you're talking about a city that's just getting started on that, is that the kind of thing you can do sort of in small chunks, or is it something you have to do as a very strategic city? I'm thinking about a big city like Detroit. It seems like a big job. Is it something that they can break down into neighborhoods, or how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And what they did, I've also seen this done in Washington, D.C., other cities where they'll look at flooding patterns and then they'll prioritize and start with particular neighborhoods and build. Once they've demonstrated and shown this actually works, then expand outward. So yeah, it's possible to start small and then connect it to a bigger scheme.
Yeah, so thank you, Stephanie. That was really great. So some of the thoughts I had was I definitely think we need green infrastructure as part of the next plan, but I think it should be very strategic. The questions Tom had about trees and type of trees, I think it would be good to task either the consultant or somebody with finding out what is the best tree for our climate. I know at one point, I think in the late or mid 60s or late 50s, they put the camphor trees everywhere. You could get an old neighbor of mine said, if you just called up the city, they'd put one for free as long as you watered it. So we put the camphor trees everywhere, and of course the sidewalks suffered, and now they're all dying all at the same time too. So it seems like that if you could get the right type of tree and get ones that do as much carbon sequestration as possible, that we really need to be strategic about. I know a lot of times people think, well, just put these things up there, they look nice, they're very green, but the amount of carbon we need to reduce, they're more like on the smaller side of reducing it, but they are important, especially the more you can get them in, so.
Yeah, and to that point, there are examples of cities who have strategically done that analysis. And the first example that comes to mind is Chicago. When they did their climate action plan and adaptation plan, they realized they looked at projections and determined what the future climate was likely to be. And they started already planting trees for that future climate.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a good example of thinking ahead.
Great. So if we could capture some of those ideas and get them to our consultant, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think.
Can I comment? I also wanted to begin by saying thank you. I was just curious if you had any ideas of how we can really record the improvements or impact made from adaptation measures or green infrastructure. I think that's something we're going to all address with the climate action plan, but if you had any specific ideas for that.
Yeah, that's a good one. And there are ongoing measurements and analyses in California in particular, but other places, measuring carbon sequestration rates of different vegetation, including wetland restoration. So there's a lot of research and measurement out there that can help us to quantify our little bits. And I know as part of the climate action plan, we are establishing indicators and metrics to help us track that improvement. And so, for example, on the stormwater, we can track, reduction in flooding. We can track, how much would it have cost to build additional gray infrastructure compared to the green infrastructure? So there's a couple ways.
Great, thank you. I'll open it up to if anybody from the public would like to come up. We'd ask you to come up and actually talk in the microphone, and then Stephanie can respond to that. So if anyone has time, please keep your comments to no more than 3 minutes, I think is what we say. Actually, it'd be nice if it was a little less than that because we're running.
Sure, yeah. So Preston Jordan, and what motivates me to come up here is actually my work at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So I attended East Bay Municipal Utilities District is what's called the Groundwater Sustainability Agency for our area under a law called SGMA or SGMA that was passed a few years ago by the state. And so it's developing, it's hired a consultant, it's got $1 million grant to develop a groundwater sustainability plan in coordination with the city of Hayward. So there's going to be a lot of work going on around understanding groundwater in this area. It's going to include development of a geologic model and a groundwater numerical simulation. And they had a stakeholder meeting last Thursday, and there were about 50 people there. And in the round robin afterwards, the keenest interest was expressed by many on the interaction between green infrastructure and groundwater, both in terms of quality, recharge, both impact and resource. And that's an area of keen interest in terms of research because a lot of the models that are out there either look at surface water, they look at groundwater, they don't really make the link between the two. So there's a lot of researchers at LBL that are experts in that area and pushing that field. And so I'm part of a team that's going to be on the technical advisory committee for that effort. So there's a possibility to get information out of that. City of Berkeley stormwater manager who was there said that there's a state mandate to map all existing green infrastructure within jurisdictions that have authority over stormwater. And so Berkeley's going to be done with that by the end of the year, and a number of other jurisdictions put in that they were going to be finished with that by the end of the year, and so there'll be GIS layers available from those cities that they're going to provide into the model. So just want to let you know that's going on, and that's something that Albany can plug into.
Thank you. That's great. Stephanie, did you have any response on that? Or it seemed like that was just all very informational and good.
Yeah, no, thanks for mentioning that Preston, because I know, throughout the state, finally the state has this new law about quantity of water as well as the quality. So a lot of good work going on. Thanks.
Anybody else want to make it? Go ahead.
Hi there. Matt Jones, just wanted to say, really love the presentation. And I think this is a really important lens when we're looking at how we design our streets and the city. I'm actually not a resident here. I'm a City of Oakland resident, but I have done work in land use and transportation planning. And I was just curious to see how this plan ties into the work that the city's doing on its transportation element of the general plan, and also the housing element as well, and just in terms of overall surface area, maybe like an existing conditions analysis that might take into account, like, for example, I know surface area parking lots take up a really large percentage of a lot of the city's total land area, and so what might that look like, when we look towards the future in terms of denser housing, transforming those parking lots into something that has more green infrastructure. So I'd just be curious to hear kind of how these different plans are talking to each other in terms of land use, overall land use. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Thanks. That's a great point, and that's another item on the agenda for tonight is looking at the connection between transportation plans and this action. So thank you for emphasizing, highlighting those points. And I know the other evening, our subcommittee was looking at depaving efforts in some cities, especially for alleyways or alongside buildings, to help with that.
So I don't see anyone else. Does anyone else? Okay. If you're interested in talking on this specific matter, the presentation, if it's something related to something coming up, we'll get to that. But go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead. Anybody else? Because you can just stand and wait till he's done. And we get it. Okay, thank you.
Hi, so Aaron Frank, Albany resident. I was coming to speak on something else, but I heard the questions about the trees and the cost benefit of the trees, and I had just read through a couple of other cities that have done some studies on this stuff. So first, with the question of mitigation, it's true that the carbon sequestration of trees in the city of Albany is going to do we'll only be able to do so much, but the numbers that I just read were that for each tree that's planted, you get about 4 times, you only get, only 1/4 of the benefit comes from the sequestration. You get 4 times as much benefit from the reduction of energy use when you plant trees in neighborhoods around the heating of, cooling of homes and that sort of thing. Particularly in Albany, if we have the sort of heating that is expected, we might go from that tipping point of not having air conditioners in homes to the point where there would be air conditioners in homes. The cooling benefits of trees in cities, the city of Palo Alto put out with their study is they estimate their canopied streets will be 6 to 8 degrees cooler than their non-canopied streets. So it's a good bit of work that's done. And in terms of cost benefit, the thing about climate mitigation is the money that we spend here in Albany, we absorb all the costs, but the benefits are completely diffuse globally. So to actually have any sort of effect here in Albany, it's very difficult by putting money towards mitigation. The only things that will actually reduce the local temperature will be things like trees that both mitigate and adapt at the same time. So, my 2 cents.
Thank you. No, that's a good point. Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to move us along to our next section, which is discussion and possible action. And first, before we get into this, we're going to trend past 9:30 at the rate we're going. So does anybody here have a deadline that's really critical? Okay, so I'll just keep moving along. Next is selection of chair and vice chair. And thank you very much, Jeff, for sending the information on the process. So I did quickly have it here, and I'll explain it to everyone. First, we'll do nominations for chair. We don't need to second no second is required. You can just make nominations. We already have 2 nominations. Once we get all the nominations, we'll vote, and we'll have a chair, and then we'll do the same thing for vice chair. And then, per the rules, we will then turn over the rest of the meeting, running the meeting, to whoever is the new chair. And I don't think anyone, anyway, so we had nomination of Samantha, and we had nomination of Max. And I guess if you're being nominated and you don't want to, you should speak up and say you don't want to do it. Are there any other nominations for chair?
And I can add, if the committee wants to discuss it for a moment or two, I think that would be fine as well.
Yeah, I
Sure.
was also going to request, could we have some discussion to hear of interests in such
Absolutely.
service?
I would like to decline the nomination.
Okay.
Because I was chair just prior to you.
Right.
So very recently, I was chair for several years.
Any other comments? I think it's good oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask Samantha, how long are you going to be here this year? I don't know if
So I
that's-
should be here all summer long. I don't know if I'm going to KALB, but I did apply. So I'll at least be here till July and likely August.
Yeah, part of my reason for nominating Samantha was that she has been vice chair. And I think it's sort of a natural progression then going to chair. And it would be very beneficial, I think, to have her energy guiding us through this portion. And I realize she won't be able to do a whole year or 2 years, but we'll have another election for someone later. So anybody else want to make nominations for chair?
Because that's unusual, I think, to have somebody only serve partial. So is there anything about that? What do we do? We just have another election?
There was nothing in Robert's Rules of Order about that. So yeah, I would assume that if Samantha's not available and not serving on the committee at some point, the committee would have another election at that time.
And another thought is that, right, the vice chair, working with her, could be prepared to shift to the role of chair.
Yeah, again, we would have to do elections, right? Because we can't just state now that that'll happen automatically. I mean, it has to be an elected position, right?
Right, I would, in the scenario where she's
Yeah.
not on the committee, I would suggest you elect a chair, presumably the vice chair, and then you elect a new vice chair. So if the new chair is not available for
Yeah.
a meeting, you've got somebody teed up to help out.
So in this nomination process, I mean, is it possible can we just ask, is there anyone here that wants to be chair? I mean, is that kosher to do, or?
Anyone can nominate themselves.
Okay, so if you want to be chair, now's the time to nominate yourself. So we have one person nominated for chair. So no other nominations? Okay, so I'll put it to a vote. All in favor of Samantha Smithies being new chair of the Climate Action Committee, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Seems to be unanimous. It's you. Okay, does it go right to, or should I go through this item that I already started, or?
I'll let you, and I think strictly speaking, Samantha is now the chair, but if she wants to let you finish this part of it, that's.
Finish your last item.
Well, I'll finish it. I mean, we had one nomination for vice chair, which was Stephanie. So if you want to take it from there, if there are any other.
Sure. Are there any other nominations for vice chair? Okay, so we'll take it to a vote. All in favor of Stephanie Sierra as vice chair?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Great.
So it. Okay, so I guess we'll be moving on to our next agenda item, which is 6.2, discussion and possible action on climate action and adaptation plan. So I think we have a short update from staff.
Yes.
Does this work?
We will have an update when I have a mouse. There we go.
Here you go.
Is
Oh,
that-
you're using that one.
Yeah. All right, thanks for your patience there. So now's the time where we're really working on our climate action plan. We've got lots going on. As you can see from our process we did in the fall, we did initial research and a community survey, and then you were here for the community workshop in January. And now we're getting busy. So in the last couple months, staff has worked closely with Cascadia Consulting as well as Rincon to draft initial high-level strategies and actions. They facilitated brainstorming discussions with staff and provided a discussion guide for both defining carbon neutrality and a discussion guide for our stakeholder focus group meetings. And we had our first stakeholder focus group on Monday on green infrastructure. Some of the things that you talked about came up in that meeting as well. It was quite a good meeting of some external stakeholders, experts in the field, as well as a lot of our public works staff who work on green infrastructure projects. So we feel good about what came out of that meeting. We have our second stakeholder meeting tomorrow afternoon on transportation. Again, we've got some people from regional agencies coming, as well as local transportation advocates. It's kind of a good mix of experts. And then we will also have a meeting with landlords and possibly renters. We had it scheduled for next Monday, but we have to cancel, so we're in the process of rescheduling. And then next week, we are also meeting with the business community. So getting all the stakeholder meetings in place. And we worked with the CAP subcommittee, and you guys will have a chance to kind of provide an overview of what you talked about. But we met with the subcommittee last Wednesday and had a great conversation, which Lizzie will go into later. And our hope is that in the next month or so, we start refining that list of strategies. So we didn't bring you the list of strategies yet because they're still in very much draft form. But you'll see your next item on the agenda. The hope is to actually use your help to start really diving into the details of those strategies. And we think it's more information that can be done in a committee meeting. And so the hope is that you may create subcommittees, dive into some of the details of the strategies, and then bring back recommendations to the committee as a whole to talk about. And at the same time, concurrently, we're working with Cascadia to draft the plan. So we had a meeting to create an outline for the plan, and we have certain elements of the plan that we're currently putting in place at the same time as creating the strategies. And then in May to June timeframe, we're thinking of having internal and public review, and then a final plan at some point, hopefully in the summer, but there's a lot of work to be done, so it may end up being early fall that we end up taking it to council. So that's where we are in the process.
Who was in that meeting Monday? Who was that?
It was green infrastructure. We had a bunch of people from our public works department. We had some landscape architects who are, Suzanne Schrift was there, and Creek Advocate. Is that it?
Yes.
Pretty much everyone from our public works department.
Are those publicly noticed?
No,
So these are invitation only?
correct. Lizzie, do you want to talk about carbon neutrality?
Yeah. So as Claire mentioned, we had a great meeting last Wednesday with our CAP 2.0 subcommittee, which was Maxway, Eric Larson, and Stephanie, and we used a template that Cascadia gave us that had 3 different definitions of what carbon neutrality could mean, basically examples that could guide our thinking on how we want to define our definition of carbon neutrality for the city of Albany. And we used those three, and we had about a 50-minute discussion, I think it was, just under an hour, about what carbon neutrality is going to mean for the city of Albany. And as you can see on the board, our goal is to define carbon neutrality as it will apply to the city of Albany and to our climate action and adaptation plan. So it will both clarify how we want to go about designing the plan and then also on our path to carbon neutrality. So. Like I said, we use, I'm just going to skim over these in the interest of time, but yeah, that's perfect. Cascadia gave us 3 different example definitions of carbon neutrality. The first one is carbon net neutral, which is emissions reductions as well as carbon sequestration, and the sequestration can either be in boundary, I think, Stephanie, that's how you describe it, in boundary, or out of boundary by purchasing offsets, which means we would maybe fund projects that are outside of the city of Albany, but we would get those credits. The next example was absolute carbon neutral, which is basically cutting off emissions at the source. So it's turning off gas, turning off, stopping the use of gasoline-powered vehicles. So we also took this into account. And then our last example was emission sources-based carbon neutrality. And that is shifting away from fossil fuels as a source of energy. So based on those 3 examples from Cascadia, our CAP 2.0 subcommittee drafted the following definition. Carbon neutrality is achieved by reducing direct emissions to 0 within the municipal boundary by a certain date, allowing the use of negative carbon sequestering offsets thereafter. And so today we're hoping as a committee you can discuss this definition of carbon neutrality and what your vision of carbon neutrality is for our plan and for the city of Albany.
Quick question. Will this presentation be available to us?
Yeah.
I'd be happy to share.
Great, thank you.
I had a quick question. Are we going to go through everything and then we'll come back to this and make a decision, or should we address this now?
I think you should address it now.
Oh, okay.
So I was going to say, if I could just add, so great, thanks for introducing that. But it was a great discussion we had, like Lizzie said, for quite an involved and discussion. And we talked about the absolute carbon neutral being a really aggressive, almost unattainable goal, as seen by a lot of people. And carbon net neutral is a little bit more practical, a little bit more achievable. You can measure it more easily. I think we talked around for a little bit, and I think that we came to a sense of we wanted to make this a really high-level goal for Albany. On one hand, Albany is so small we don't really have that much control over the metro environment. But then again, Albany's small, and we can set a high goal for ourselves and really work on controlling what we can control. So I thought it was really fantastic that we came to this point of saying that we're talking about 0 direct emissions and getting to a point of absolute neutrality. And yes, it is a really high goal, and we knew that going into this statement. So I just wanted to make sure that that you knew that we didn't just make that just as an offhand thing. It was like a very concerted effort to make this a high goal and to sort of set a standard for the Bay Area as Albany is being setting the standard. So that was sort of, I just wanted to interject that part.
Yeah, thank you.
So, sorry.
Was your thinking around this that we would transition from gas to electricity as a source? Is that behind this? Is that the idea?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, electrify is a big part of it. Transportation is a big part of it. We made sure to say that our first goal is to cut emissions. And then the secondary part is the carbon sequestering and offsets. We would only allow ourselves to use offsets if they are carbon sequestering offsets, and that was an important part of this to us. But yes, definitely direct emissions were the biggest part, and that's a super difficult thing to do. Yep.
So I had thoughts on this too. So first of all, our next climate action plan, although it does have a goal we're aiming for in, I think, 2035, and then another one in 2050, it's really the ultimate 2050 goal. So this is a 30-year plan. This is not something we're going to do tomorrow. This is not something we're going to do in 10 years. We're going to map it out to achieve the end result in 30 years. So we could just kick the can down the road and put off doing anything until at the last minute, and that's very painful. But we've kind of learned this lesson, and I get really worried when you start talking about offsets, because ultimately you're just shifting the burden of your task to somebody else, and then you're paying them for it. And I don't think that's in the spirit of what we're trying to do as citizens of a very ecologically conscious community. So I would say...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's where Max made a really good point of making sure that we've stated this so that it's not offsets. It's carbon sequestering offsets is the only thing that we would consider.
Who's doing the carbon sequestering? Third world country? I mean, if we're not doing it, so here's my thing. You can take that, and then all of a sudden you can say, oh, we're not going to shut the gas off to the city. We'll continue to burn gas because somewhere else is sequestering carbon for us. I think that's a cop-out. I think we should go for absolute neutrality.
Can I, I want to clarify, because I think you're projecting a scenario that is not what we're talking about here.
What are offsets?
So the idea is we're going for carbon neutrality within the city. Recognize, so here's one example. Air travel. That is something we don't have our own plane powered by renewable aviation fuel. Almost no one has that. So the idea is that we do everything very actively and before 30 years, because the latest report, scientific consensus, is we have 12 years. So I think we're actually pushing a very aggressive goal here, and only for those things that are quite, that we can't accomplish within the boundaries of the city, that we would make up for those emissions only with a particular type of project that we would fund.
I didn't see within the boundary of the cities for the offsets.
That we would fund ideally nearby, just because Albany, with its postage stamp size area, there may be some things we can't squeeze within the boundaries of the city. So we'd look to do them nearby, and to do things that have a local benefit as well as the larger benefit, which I think Aaron Frank was pointing out.
Okay.
So can I just add to that?
Sure.
So we did have a discussion about offsets, and so I think we were just trying to make a distinction between conventional offsets, which are those that you could obtain on the market today, which are to say like a green certificate or a REC, which could be something which is in a developing country. You're purchasing a clean power offset, which is providing solar power in India, for example. But we didn't feel that that was a sustainable pathway for the future, thinking about the longer term, like 2040 timeframe-ish, 2040-ish timeframe. So what we mean by a negative carbon offset is really something that is removing carbon from the atmosphere. And I'd like to just distinguish, or just mention that that's not strictly carbon sequestration, carbon capture and storage. It could be something which is a carbon removal technology, which could be taking CO2 and putting it into products, for example, which have a very long life, cement perhaps. So that was the distinction we were trying to draw. And I just wanted to reemphasize Stephanie's point, is that we were not necessarily thinking of a 2050 timeframe, but trying to reel that in because the state has, as we know, a 2045 goal for net zero carbon, although it's not strictly defined. And Albany is a much smaller community, and I think Stephanie was actually proposing 2030, which really, was very bold. But those are the types of conversations we were having. So
Yeah.
that just kind of gives a little bit more
Right.
backdrop.
So, just so I feel like my point isn't quite being understood. I don't think I got across very well. So Stephanie brought in the aspect of things outside the boundary of what we're personally creating, as in consumptive. So if you go on jet travel, or if you buy very expensive manufactured goods or something like that, I was thinking more as far as just, the housing, the transportation, and those issues. What I want to make sure is that we really address the ones that we more clearly understand we're generating. And then I'm all for, so what you're saying here, allowing use of negative carbon sequestering offsets for outside municipal boundary creation or something like that, right? That's what I heard you say. Because flying a jet, you're not going to fly a jet in Albany.
Well,
I'm asking
I think
a
it was,
question.
so Nick, I think we all agree with that sentiment of direct emissions first, absolutely. And that was, we're not considering offsets at all, really, in this discussion. So I think it was the direct emissions within municipal boundary is that's job one. And then if there is, there's going to be some things that are just impossible to remove. And if it turns out to be that there are things that are impossible to remove, we would allow ourselves those offsets, but only under those conditions. I think that was the way
I
the
guarantee
conversation went.
you.
So if it doesn't read that way,
I
then
guarantee you certain property owners will say it's impossible for them to stop emitting certain things. So what I don't want is to have some chink here or some loophole where, so if we're very clear that within the boundary it's going to be zero, I think that's totally great. And then negative carbon sequestering offsets can be used to diminish creation outside the boundary.
Yeah, I
That
think
makes
that's
sense to me.
okay. That's a good point, and I think we should keep going to hit all the other elements.
Yeah, I'm just saying. So this is the beginning of of creating a definition, and I think we actually have to define what negative carbon sequestering offsets are, and perhaps we need to create criteria for when those would be used. And so we can take your feedback and play with the definition and bring it back again, if that's okay. And I think we should take public comment on this item, but we have one more slide and maybe
Sure.
take then public comment for the whole thing. So that works? Okay.
Can I make a really quick comment before we move on? I wonder if part would help if we move within the municipal boundary to before to zero. I think that'd be kind of just a simple change that might help.
Yeah.
Any other comments on just sort of the nature of this? We like I said, we intended this to be high bar, setting a standard.
Well, the only thought I had was this is all going to be in a time frame with all sorts of stick and carrot things going on and to develop this. But I just want to make, what is important to me is that we own up to the fact that we need to stop using fossil fuels by a certain point. Boy, the one about air travel is really difficult. I agree. But within the city, the other thing is, I wanted to say, part of what's going on, this for benefit of people in the audience, we're a little town, we don't do much, who cares? Who cares if Albany, stops emitting carbon, we're so small. But I think we have an opportunity to do something and show other municipalities and combine with other municipalities in accomplishing this. And I think we see the same thing in the carbon-free Albany, where we need to get everybody on the same page. And we can do that as a community, and then we can help other communities as an example. So I think there's a real importance in doing this.
And then if we can move on to the CAB objectives.
Yes. So next we have, we also talked with our CAP 2.0 subcommittee about what are 6 objectives for our climate action and
Procedure, I thought you said we were going to have.
After this last slide.
So we discussed these 6 CAP objectives that, so the way the structure of the climate action adaptation plan will work is we'll have an objective, which is like an overarching theme, and then we'll have actions that go along with those objectives, if that makes sense. So we came in with objectives that we as staff had been working on with Cascadia based on comments from the Climate Action Committee, the survey, and our public workshop. And then with our CAP 2.0 subcommittee, we narrowed it, changed some wording, narrowed it down, and these are the 6 objectives that we currently have. So we'd like to open it up to the CAC to discuss these objectives as a group.
Anyone would like to begin?
Well, and these are pretty much what we had before, what we saw last month, but we did make the change on the enhanced energy efficiency in buildings to make it across the board on just buildings, and then within that is the property owners and rental properties and everything that entails. So that was one thing we took in that.
For objective 3, increase active transport and transit, is that mainly a like anti-car objective? So would included in that be trying to minimize car transportation or gas car transportation, or would it just be trying to increase public transit and active transit use?
So I think that we talked about that. So electrify includes the conversion from fossil fuel cars to electric cars as a big part of that objective. And then the active transport, yes, is the going away from that kind of vehicle transportation to other forms of pedestrian bikes, mass transit, that sort of thing. So I thought it was great to have 2 different points of transition there.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I had a question about objective 6. Are what we're trying to achieve is a climate resilient city, right? So I think it would be helpful if it was more specific, because that seems very too broad to me. Number 6. That could mean a lot of things, but I think if we're talking about resiliency, that the city can be a great place to live in 50 years.
Based on Stephanie's presentation, I can see how objective 6 and objective 4 would be tied together as far as that. So maximizing green infrastructure would help accomplish objective 6. It maybe if we wanted to make objective 6 a more specific sort of changing climate, like heat or floods, that maximizing green infrastructure could, like, that could be a priority of maximizing green infrastructure.
Yeah, but Tom, I appreciate your comment to make it active and positive, like enhance the resilience of our city in a changing climate. Positive goal, not hiding from storms. So, yeah, thank you.
Any other comments from committee members?
I thought this was all well put together. So I mean, I think this outlines what we see as important things to do. Within each of these, then, will be discussed specifically strategies to make this happen. So we don't need to worry that nothing's being referenced about any strategies.
Correct.
Okay.
There has been conversation about an order to these, but it's not, you don't have to decide now what the order is.
No.
We have plenty of time for that.
Okay.
I was also going to comment on the order, and I was even thinking, do we really need to have an order, and is there some way to like give names to these without ordering them? I also feel like there needs to be some statement kind of underlining the interconnectedness between a lot of these, and so the idea that they're not all separate things, and kind of figuring out how our strategies can really match multiple objectives. And then my other comment was on objective 5. I think there might be a different terminology for carbon-free economy that's used more frequently. So I think like there's zero carbon economy or decarbonized economy that are more regularly used. And so I think that might provide a little bit more clarity to objective 5.
Does the committee have a preference of those terms? This was our circular or our consumption item, and then we sort of talked about it a lot at the subcommittee and came up with something about economy. But is there a preferred term, zero carbon economy?
Did this come from the consultant? I mean, maybe we should ask them.
No, it came from the subcommittee.
No, it came from
Oh,
the subcommittee. I think we've heard input, and then the subcommittee can go back and do their refinements in wordsmithing off the clock here.
Can someone expand on what exactly a carbon-free economy is?
Okay, I can take that. Right, the idea that what is driving a lot of fossil fuel use is the type of highly consumptive economy that we have. And so that, I mean, we need a healthy economy for the city to thrive. So looking at supporting businesses that provide services or products that are not fossil intensive, that are not energy intensive. So really looking to enhance the economy in a way that's not destructive.
Or like
Right, alternatives to plastics, repair shops, naturally sourced materials. Yeah,
Thank you.
great.
Okay, and if there's no more committee comment, then I'll open up the floor to public comment, and you'll have 3 minutes, and just go ahead to the mic.
If you'd like, I can run the clock, or just...
Thank you very much. There's a lot to react to. So on this slide, I would suggest that maximized green infrastructure is best viewed as a tool, so not an objective in its own right, but a tool, a measure that would fall under both Objective 6 and Objective 3. As well, research has shown that the presence of street trees significantly increases the number of people that choose walking for transportation. So I think that would help to simplify it. There might be a way to collapse Objective 1 and 2 as well, so you don't have quite as big a list. 6 gets beyond what people can digest kind of on a first glance. So I think if you get down to 4, you'd be better off at the objective level. And if you go back to the proposed definition of carbon neutrality, please. So my suggestion on that is a lot of the emissions due to activities within the municipal boundary are not direct emissions from within the municipal boundary. So for instance, prior to being on Brilliant 100, most of the emissions due to electricity, well, almost all the emissions due to electricity were not within the municipal boundary. So I think this could be readily misunderstood. I would suggest saying instead, carbon neutrality is achieved by reducing emissions due to activities within the municipal boundary to 0. For instance, for fossil fuel use, about 20% of the petroleum use in California is from the steam injection in California oil fields, and that is as dirty as tar sands in terms of carbon intensity. And so about a fifth to a third of the emissions from those fuels happen outside of the municipal boundary. They're happening in the oil fields. So I would suggest focusing on the activities that cause the emissions, not where the emissions occur. And I'm still confused about the allowing use of negative carbon sequestering offsets. If offsets are allowed to be used to offset fossil fuel use in the city, offsets out I'm still confused on that. And while I'm up here, one other item to apprise you on is that Berkeley is seeking to be fossil fuel free by 2030, and it tasked its Energy Commission with coming up with a report to head towards that goal. They have 4 fast-track proposals. This came out just in January. And of those 4, Albany's already done number 1, which was go to 100% carbon-free electricity. And number 4 actually started with Albany, even though our council didn't see fit to pursue it. So I'll just read it. It says, lead a regional effort to make changes to the utility users tax structure in order to assess taxes on natural gas usage separately from electricity usage. Once complete, the city should submit a referendum to voters that would raise the tax on natural gas and dedicate the funds to decarbonization efforts. So this would be a measure that would be under Objective 1, and Max Way on the committee did a lot of work on getting this going. went out. Berkeley adopted it, Oakland's adopted it, and they want to move forward, and they're looking for cities to join with them in funding PG&E to make the change to the billing system. So hopefully Albany will join in on what we actually started. Thanks.
Can I just respond to the second comment that Preston made? So thank you, Preston. I think for the second point you're making, just about the offsets, so I think it would, just to step back for a moment, if we're just looking at buildings and transportation, so those are within, well, I mean, just leaving aside this municipal boundary, which is very confusing, but those are things which we could say we could ban fossil fuels. That could be a goal. That could be an objective for an Albany. For example, I think you had recently proposed we can try to phase out natural gas heating appliances in the future and move wholly to electric heat pumps, and that would have that effect of phasing out fossil fuels. But I think the context for this was that we don't like offsets, conventional offsets, and we were thinking of a wider scope of emissions, which it's true are not currently being tracked very well. Those could be consumption-based emissions. They could be airline emissions, which are international. The state doesn't even track those currently. So it's in that context. There are some, I mean, realistically, there are some sectors which are very difficult to decarbonize. So that was the context. But if we're just thinking buildings, transportation, passenger vehicles, then I think, I agree with you, then I think we should probably be a lot more aggressive. So I don't know if that makes more sense or helps.
And if there's more public comment.
My name's Ian McLeod. Good evening. I'd like to say 100% support what you're doing. It's great work. It's really important. The time for passing this off to future generations is over. It's time for us to act. So this is super important. Yeah, his point was interesting. I mean, I'm an architect. Sometimes we talk about site zero versus source zero, you know, so there is this distinction. You can eliminate site, you can bring things to zero on a site, but you're still producing pollution elsewhere. Even electricity is not necessarily benign. It may be just pollution elsewhere. But if we can get to renewable sources, that's great. That's really a great goal. The other thing I really would like to encourage is looking at the building codes, green building reach codes. You know, I don't know much in the way of specifics at the moment. I'm also on the Planning and Zoning Commission, but I'm not speaking on their behalf. But I would just love to see a much more robust green building approach to how things are done in Albany. And there's a lot of potential. I think this whole eliminating gas is within reach. I've been designing and building all-electric houses for a couple years now. It's quite feasible. They work great. The appliances work great. The electrical heat pumps are super efficient. You know, it's just a no-brainer. To have a new building being constructed and not incorporating all that, to me, is really a shame right now, because all the technology we need to make net zero houses, it's there. It's all there. You know, we don't have to go out and invent some new technology. It's all possible right now. So I really support new green building standards and pushing them as far as we can reasonably go. I don't see why not. So please work on that. I'll be happy to try to provide more input as it goes along. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. If there's any more public comment.
Hi there, Matt Jones again. I just wanted to touch on some comments that some other folks had just made prior to me regarding energy. I'm also part of a group, I'm originally from the city of San Bruno, part of a group called the No PG&E Bailout Coalition. And we're working right now to have conversations with the California Public Utilities Commission, the governor's office, to try to talk about what it might look like to transition away from natural gas, do entirely electrical grid, entirely renewable energy. And there is a policy window that's open right now at the state And I know with the direction that Berkeley just took, which this gentleman just said earlier, 100% renewable by 2030, I just think it would maybe behoove the commission, if you haven't already, to reach out to state officials and kind of, so that they know, that Berkeley's doing this, that Albany's doing this, that we're having these conversations, that they know that there's demand at the local level to take these bold policy initiatives. That would be incredibly helpful for our efforts. And also wanted to add that we have a petition that a number of folks have signed on to already, including the California Green Party just announced that they signed on yesterday. And so if folks here are interested in having a conversation about that further, feel free to let me know. Thanks.
Thank you. And any more public comment?
I'm Gerhard Brostrom, 1116 Curtis Street. As a founder of Transition Albany, I want to say that I'm very impressed with what I've seen here today. I had been concerned when I saw a city council meeting on the video that said that the mayor was going to consider waiting till next year to hear the plan and consider the plan. Tonight, I'm seeing the kind of urgency that we'd really hoped for from this group. So I'm very pleased to see that your timeframes are focused on this year and early this year. That's my main focus tonight. I want to make sure that you know that Transition Albany is here to do a lot of the very soft technology aspects. Training, films, gardening, lots of things like that. So while you're doing this official work on behalf of the city and for the more official parts of what we need to do with climate change, don't disregard the volunteer, many groups that are increasingly quite focused on climate. So we look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if there isn't anybody else, we'll move on to 6.3, and we're going to try to get through this one quickly. So discussion and possible motion to establish ad hoc subcommittees to review. And I think the idea behind this is that the current CAP subcommittee has a lot to go over, and we wanted to try to break that down. So there's a couple ways we can do this, either breaking it down by emission sectors or kind of related to the objectives that we were talking about before. But we just kind of wanted to get some input on if people are interested in that and how the current CAP subcommittee feels.
Right, and I would add to that with the objectives, because this is a big job, and we want to have all committee members involved and connecting with the public. So we were looking to perhaps have 4 ad hoc subcommittees where we could make some of the combinations that were noted this evening, like we could combine the green infrastructure and resilience component and have a subcommittee on that. Have one on buildings, one on transport.
Yeah, I kind of see them as like 3 points: resiliency, electrification, and consumption, but I don't know exactly how we want to break it down. I think there's a way that we can maybe simplify it.
I thought some of the suggestions Preston made were really good.
Yeah,
I think we get a little caught up on, this is a little different, but electrification is a big thing. It includes buildings and transportation. I could see 1 and 2 going together. 3 is its own thing, and then I liked 4 and 6 going together, and then you got 4. So if we had 4, I would try to get this to 4 objectives. I agree having that. I don't think it muddies the water. I actually think it focuses it a bit more, and within each objective is going to get expanded anyway. So there'll be a lot of meat in each objective.
What were you thinking that each of these subcommittees, what's the deliverable for each one? What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're kind of trying to come up with that now, but I think really focusing on specifically diving deeper into the strategies that would fit under these objectives. And as we were talking about, kind of elaborating more than just 3 words about what their objective would actually mean or what that sector would actually be focusing on.
Yeah, so staff actually we're preparing a memo for, each of these objectives, but we could change it with information, sort of suggestions for how to structure a discussion, and then basically a matrix where you can fill in your answers so that so that each subcommittee is providing kind of a similar format for discussion, where you talk about, you look at the list of strategies, we'll send you, your subcommittee, the list of strategies for whichever objective or two that you've signed up for. Look at the list of strategies to discuss pros and cons of the strategy, possible unintended consequences. If you feel you could do some research on your particular objective, if you think that there's things that are missing as well, and we can give some justification for why we've suggested, or why Cascadia has suggested these particular strategies. But the idea is diving deeper into that conversation and then bringing that analysis back to the committee as a whole.
I had a question. So how much support and backup data and, just general knowledge are we going to get from the consultant on? I mean, part of what I thought we were getting from them was sort of knowledge in these areas and information from them. Is that kind of, we're going to go back, they'll present packages of this that then we can follow through on and see about that, or just how much are they putting together or suggesting strategies?
I mean, the strategies came from them based on community survey, community workshop, stakeholder meetings. It's all, the strategies came from Cascadia's understanding of, what other caps have been successful and what's happening in the field and what will have the biggest carbon emission savings, but also from community interest. So it's a combination of all those things.
Right, so to clarify, yes, we have this all the good work of the consultant, and this is part of the dialogue process.
So I'm not quite sure how we want to structure this. Is there any specific ideas?
I took down, the notes I have are transportation, building energy, green infrastructure and adaptation / resilience, and then the zero carbon economy, but some people suggested morphing some of those. I highly recommend not morphing objective 1, 2, and 3. They're sort of the meatiest of them all. So I think you could do objective 1 and 2 together easily, but I wouldn't put 3 with there as well.
So I would suggest, I like the idea of buildings, transportation, and then maybe adding a third, which is green infrastructure / resilience, and maybe just holding off on the last one just because it might be too much, and also we're not really tracking it, but that's just my suggestion.
I like those combinations, but I do think we need to think about systemic change, and that's why we're looking at consumption and developing strategies for tackling that. So if that seems off-putting, I'd be happy to be on that subcommittee.
Well, yeah, I was going to say one suggestion too is you could have the 3 subcommittees, and then the CAP subcommittee that already exists could look at consumption too, if that was of interest to you.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're kind of at a challenge because there's only 7 of us and we want 4 subcommittees. So I don't know, does it feel feasible for us to have all 4, or do we want to postpone one of them?
I really discourage you from postponing.
Can't postpone.
Because we need to move forward in April.
So, you could be on more than one subcommittee, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think we can manage that. We'll make it work.
Right. Might I suggest, in the interest of time, because we have another really important agenda item, Claire, could we have each committee member send you a note about their interests in which subcommittee to serve on?
We could do our best with that, as long as you realize you're not voting on who's going to be on which subcommittee. Well, normally, if you were forming a subcommittee, I think you would vote on that. You all agree who's going to be on which committee. It would kind of be a self-selection. Somehow you'd self-select, and
Okay.
I'd volunteer for transportation.
I also volunteer for transportation.
Great.
So I would do electrify and increase, well, that's transportation, I already got two. Enhance building energy efficiency, so 1 and 2.
Okay.
And I'll
I
add
can-
electrify as well. I mean, if that's still
Okay.
on there.
I can volunteer for electrify our buildings.
Just to clarify, what I have here is transportation, building energy, which is objective 1 and 2, zero carbon economy, and green infrastructure and adaptation. So
Did electrify become transportation?
No, those are
Buildings.
two separate. So we still have space for one more on transportation, and we're missing people on green infrastructure and then the carbon-free economy.
I have Eric and Allison on transportation and Nick on building energy.
And Eric and Max also on building energy.
Okay.
If I got that right.
I can volunteer for transportation also.
Okay. So left is green infrastructure, resiliency, and consumption. Great.
I'll work on those.
I can do that too. Okay, so just to clarify, building and electrification is Nick, Eric, and Max. Transportation is Eric, Allison, and Max. Green infrastructure / resiliency is Tom, Stephanie, and myself. And then consumption is Tom, Stephanie, and myself. Is that sound right to everybody?
That's fine with me, but the people who are on 2 committees you're committing to a lot of work in the next month. Just want to make sure everyone's okay with that. Okay.
The planet's at stake.
Yes, it's true. Thank you. Thank you for your work. We will send strategies to each of the people on these subcommittees early next week. But in the meantime, I suggest putting dates on your calendars. And then plan to report out in April.
Great. So then we can move ahead to 6.4, if we're all set with that. And that is discussion and possible motion on Solano Avenue complete streets, which I know we have a lot to discuss.
I'll say.
Oh.
Oop. All right, we've momentarily lost
We're just not
projection
getting the
power,
screen.
but
You know, I think I can just wing this without a PowerPoint, given the time. I don't want to fool around with it. If
No, there it was.
Oh.
No, it's the other one.
So the item before you is a complete streets planning study for Solano Avenue. This is something that we began work on about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago. The idea is to look at the east end of Solano Avenue, basically from the BART tracks east to Tulare. For those of you who pay real detailed attention to city limit lines, the street itself on the, oh, there it is. Perfect. So this is on the south side of Solano, and the street itself is within the city of Albany. The north side of the street at Safeway, in the middle of the block at the Safeway block, is the start of Berkeley. So there's a little jag, a little change in the city limit line just to get you oriented. The idea here is to work on a upgrade to the urban design and streetscape and transportation function of the street. I'll go through these pretty quickly. I know you're going to have some public comments about making some suggestions about changes to the plan, which is great. When we began the process, the goal was to improve pedestrian and bicycle safety and access, strengthen transit access, manage curbside activity, which means just kind of the landscaping, the bus stops, so forth, enhancing the streetscape elements, and doing what you can to make sure that it's an economically vibrant area. It's not a wide street by most standards. It has an 80-foot right-of-way and 60 feet of pavement. It also serves as the city's east-west truck route. It's the only legal place to drive a truck east-west through the city. Marin Avenue is not a truck route. And it is also a fairly busy transit line for AC Transit. The report that was attached to your agenda is the draft report. It's scheduled to go to City Council next month. I'm going to just very quickly go through just kind of visually some of the recommendations that are contained in the report. I should probably point out it was prepared by a consulting team. Tool Design Group is a national transportation firm. They have a Berkeley office that was the lead consultant on this, and also involved Opticos, which is also a Berkeley-based and nationally recognized urban design firm. So just to kind of go through this real quickly, some of the different elements that are in the plan, murals and green walls to kind of provide some visual vibrancy, different types of elements in the right-of-way. Yes, there's some parking. We can talk about that. I think that's an important issue that will be further discussed. Ideas of adding bike parking, parklets, accommodating bus stops, and doing it in an interesting way. Buses and bus stops and buslets, which is a bus stop and a parklet at the same time. We have one now. We'd like to do a second one. We're planning to do a second one, and there may be other opportunities to do that as well. We're also, as part of the economic vibrancy, is to create a sense of place with branding and, again, kind of visual enhancements to the street. It is an old street. It really needs a new palette, if you will, of things to liven it up. Mentioned most of these elements already, taking a look at street trees, improving the green infrastructure with various types of rain gardens to capture and filter some of the storm water before it goes into the storm drain, enhancing the furnishings and the trash cans and so forth. And then to do what we can to make it a safer street and a visually more attractive street with, in some cases, perhaps pedestrian refuge islands, making sure the stormwater is managed properly and so forth. So with almost any transportation plan, the big issue, I think, is boiling down to parking. It almost always does. We didn't start with parking as the issue. We didn't want to make this a parking study. We really wanted to talk about establishing a vision for the urban environment. The plan as drafted is basically maintaining and perhaps even adding a few existing vehicle spaces. I realize this runs counter to some of the principles that this committee has, and I can appreciate that. And you certainly would welcome your comments or recommendations to the City Council on that. There's also some discussion of back-end angle parking as an alternative to the front-end angle parking. I think it's recognized as being safer. It's also, it freaks some people out, basically, to summarize it. So what we'd like to do as an example for back-end parking with City Council approval is to do a demonstration someplace so people can get comfortable with it. And then to give you just kind of a context for this, this is a big picture conceptual plan. It's not a design. It's not a construction project. It's really a vision. What we'd like to do, if this is approved by the City Council, is start to develop pilot projects or temporary treatments to test things, to see what works and doesn't work. Start to incorporate it into our funding plans and grant applications. And then usually with these kinds of projects, we implement them incrementally. one large project is in some ways, it's very painful to do, but you can incorporate it all at once, but it does make it a little bit harder to fund. And maybe beyond our capacity to do it all in one bite. In terms of next steps, this has gone through a process for about a year. It's had a number of community meetings. There's a community advisory group. There have been various community meetings. It's kind of making its last swing through the various committees and commissions. The Traffic and Safety Commission has made a recommendation at their meeting last month to make some changes to incorporate a recommendation that Preston Jordan, who's here, who will probably talk about that and is a member of that commission, made at that meeting to add a bicycle cycle track on the eastbound side of the street. And our tentative schedule is still tentative, but the plan at the moment is to continue getting comments and taking this to the City Council on April 15th. So there's a webpage for people who are interested in more details, SolanoCompleteStreets.org, where people can look at the plan in detail, submit comments, and so forth. I'm happy to answer any questions now. I know it's a late hour, but I suspect that Preston will want a little extra time to present something, or not. I'll let him ask you for that. And I'll leave it to him to explain in more detail what he's proposing as an alternative to the draft report. I should say that we are taking his suggestion seriously, and we've asked the consultant to review it in detail and make sure that make sure we understand what he's proposing. And so it's not being ignored by any means.
Question? Are there any requirements for how much parking we need on Solano? So if we were reducing the number of parking spaces, is there anything preventing us from doing that?
Legally, no, with perhaps the exception of maybe some accessible parking spaces. It's really a political question. You could get rid of all the parking on the street if you wanted to, probably. I don't know that it's parking. There's a very broad spectrum of views about parking.
I'm talking about reducing, not eliminating. So there's nothing to prevent us from changing how parking is configured on Solano, which might reduce the number of spaces.
That's correct. The only technical issue is that it is a truck route and it is a bus route, and emergency vehicles need to be able to maneuver around.
And my other question was related to that being a truck route, because that's one of the things that makes it unsafe riding a bicycle. Is there anything that prohibits us from changing Marin to a truck route?
Marin is a residential. It's a residential neighborhood. It's a busy street in the middle of a residential neighborhood, a single-family residential neighborhood. So technically, there's no reason why it couldn't be a truck route. Ideally, you wouldn't want to have a truck route going through a residential neighborhood. You want truck routes in commercial districts. This is our east-west commercial district, so it's a trade-off. But technically, no. You could change it to Marin if the city council wanted.
Thank you.
I just had a quick question. Hopefully this is a short answer. If it's a long answer, then I'll pass. But did the consultant think that they were achieving the original goals, which was increased active transportation in the Solano? Did they think that their plan addressed that?
As a starting point, they used the bicycle designations that are in the general plan, and this is not a bicycle designated bicycle route in the general plan.
So I had some thoughts about this. Can
I suggest you get public comment before you discuss the item?
I thought we were discussing the item.
This is your question and answer period.
Yeah.
So we want to take in that input from the public.
I'm more than happy to do that.
And so if you have comment, you're welcome to come up now.
Hi, my name is Gregory Hoff. I'm a long-term resident of the 700 block of Key Route. Just when I looked at the plan that they had, my wife and I are very much in favor of improving Solano Avenue. We are both children of the 50s. It's time to move on from that. You know, I think we can all agree on that. And most of the stuff that I saw, we like very much. The one thing we had specific heartburn about the plan that we saw in the newspaper is on the southbound lane of Key Route. In the middle of the 800 block, it curves into the northbound lane and becomes two one-way streets. And I'm not a traffic engineer, but my humble opinion, that would slow down traffic and back up traffic on Key Route very significantly, which you all are concerned about emissions, and there's a lot of, you know, that's a big walking street. So it seems to me that would cause a lot of congestion. I think also would just cause a lot of congestion at the intersection of Solano and Key Route. So I would just see that it seems that change would make that intersection more dangerous. It also would drive, again, in my opinion, would drive more traffic. Solano people would not go to Solano, then they would use Washington and/or Portland more often to go east and west through Albany, which obviously, if you talked about Marin being a residential street, those are residential streets, and I think that would be a little bit more dangerous. A lot of kids walking there, a lot of kids going from the high school and the middle school. It could possibly reduce the number of trees in the median. I can't say that for sure, but it looked like one of the things that was proposed was then, the reason they wanted to do that was they were going to build a parklet at the end of that street. And this is my recollection from what I saw in the newspaper. I don't see the little parklet on the end of immediately adjacent to Solano is particularly safe for kids, or maybe particularly safe for adults, particularly when basically a half a block away underneath the BART tracks, there's a little parklet in a play area that I walk by there all the time, and people use that quite a bit, and it's used very much for both kids and adults. So I'm just checking my little notes, and I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. So again, I would support improving Solano Avenue very much, but I think that specific change would be dangerous. I think you would want to leave it two-way traffic on northbound and southbound all the way down to Solano and Key Route. Thank you.
Thank you.
Preston Jordan, has been noted, I'm a traffic and safety commissioner, but I'm here speaking on my own behalf. But I will say to the comment that the prior gentleman made that the Traffic and Safety Commission also keyed in, if you will, on that change at Key Route and the design. The design that is shown has a pretty sharp left turn for southbound motorists and then a stop sign and a right turn, and we were encouraging looking at different designs that wouldn't add another stop sign there because we did not want to divert motorists to other streets. So that is a comment that was submitted as a part of the motion at Traffic and Safety Commission and presumably will be reflected in the final product. I'm not going to present the cross sections that I came up with based on public input. I'll give you a little background on that. There was obviously a lot of concern about back-end angle parking as a primary alternative. The plan doesn't show it as a primary alternative. The active transportation plan has been misrepresented. While it does not designate Solano as a bicycle route per se, if you look at the Solano Avenue plan in the active transportation plan, it's project number 9. And it explicitly says that the Solano Avenue project will make biking safer. So the alternative that is in front of you, actually the main alternative, makes biking more dangerous. It narrows the lanes to 11 feet between a center island and the bulb out. By comparison, the distance from the center line to the bulb out edge on Solano between Masonic and San Pablo is 13 feet. That's already sort of uncomfortably narrow for motorists to be passing cyclists. 11 feet would be astronomically uncomfortable to the point that a lot of people would just give up biking on Solano altogether. So this primary alternative actually goes entirely the wrong direction relative to the commitment that the city made in the active transportation plan. So the cross sections that I came up with were a desire to meet prior policy as committed to in the Climate Action Plan from 2009, the Active Transportation Plan from 2012, the Complete Streets Policy, which oddly is not even cited in this document, the draft document, which I find exceedingly odd. That was adopted in 2013, the general plan adopted in 2016, and it maintains the parking inventory approximately. It has an uphill separated cycling facility, and then has basically a cyclist taking the lane downhill, which is not that difficult to do. It's not something everybody's going to be comfortable with, but it's fairly reasonable. We actually have a engineer from SFMTA who's a part of one of the groups that I'm a part of, Albany Strollers and Rollers, who has said that that's the approach they take in San Francisco to provide a separated facility uphill and a shared lane facility downhill. This would also provide wider sidewalks. The sidewalks that are proposed in the primary alternative are about as wide as on Solano that was rebuilt in the 90s from Masonic to San Pablo. And while those are wider and better, they're actually still fairly narrow when you add in all the cafe furniture, street trees, and other things that are going on. So this would actually provide a sidewalk where people can pass each other more comfortably. And then finally, I've been looking at all these previous policy documents, and it's exceedingly odd that it proposes to increase car parking by about 10%, because Albany's had a grant-funded parking study, and it found that parking was so little occupied, car parking, that it wasn't even worth charging for. So you've got this fundamental contradiction, and our parking study says the parking occupancy on Solano is about 65%. You really can't start charging for car parking until the occupancy goes up to about 85%. Therefore, we don't need more car parking. But then one of the primary advantages of the plan that's been proposed to you is to add more car parking. And just reading that tonight, I found that one of the recommendations in that parking study was make Solano Avenue and San Pablo Avenue accessible to all users through multiple modes, increasing trips via transit, bicycling, walking, and ride sharing as feasible and appropriate can create significant benefits for the public parking system. Albany, Solano Avenue, and San Pablo Avenue commercial areas are in an opportunity area with convenient access to AC transit bus service and within reasonable biking distance to El Cerrito BART, and it goes on and on. So this primary alternative isn't even really honoring the parking study itself. So the Traffic and Safety Commission voted that this other alternative that I developed based on public input and trying to balance all the stakeholder interests should be included in the final product, and we'll see what that looks like. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm available, obviously, to answer them.
Thank you. Do we want to make a motion before? Because we're getting into night.
Good evening. I'm Harry Chomsky. I'm speaking for Albany Strollers and Rollers tonight. So what I think happened in the development of this plan is that the consultants realized that there were some bus stops that were painted as red curb and not available for car parking. And some of those bus stops were not needed. AC Transit didn't need as many bus stops as there were in the area. So they were able to take away some of that red curbing. And what that does is it frees up curb space. Curb space is extremely valuable, and it can be used in a lot of different ways. And it seems like the choice made in the primary alternative was to use that curb space that would have been freed up to increase the amount of car parking. And I think, and Albany Strollers and Rollers thinks that that goes against the objectives of the city and the climate action plan and the goal of increasing active transportation, and that was an ill-advised decision for some of the reasons Preston just said. Also, we have probably more car parking than we really need. An ideal occupancy of car parking in a thriving district is about 85%. When it gets more full than that, then it feels too hard to find a parking space. People get discouraged. And the solution to that is to put in parking meters that charge the right amount, so that some people will choose to park a little farther away and avoid paying the meter, and the people who don't want to walk that far can easily find a metered space on the block and pay for it. And if you find that the occupancy goes too low, that means you're charging too much. You reduce the charge and the occupancy goes above 85%, then it's too full, too hard to find a space. It means you're not charging enough. You raise the price a little bit. That you can use these tools to get the occupancy to 85%. In Albany, the occupancy hasn't even reached 85%. So we can't use any of those tools. We basically have more, we basically are devoting curb space to parking that is not needed for parking. So what we feel is that the there should have been more of a discussion about what to do with that additional space. And one thing to do with it, which we support, is the plan that the design that Preston came up with, which is to turn some of the car parking from angled to parallel, which takes up less of the street space. It also makes fewer car parking spaces, but balanced against removing the bus stops, it comes out about where we started, with approximately the same number of car parking spaces. And then you have extra width that you can use for a protected bike lane going uphill. So we hope you'll agree that the goal of increasing active transportation usage and making the street more inviting for people to be able to get there by bicycle, by scooter, as scooters become a more important part of the fabric of our transportation. We would really like to see the main place where people go shopping in Albany be a place where people can bike and use scooters to get to their shopping and do that easily. It's not a bike route in the sense of a commuter route. It's not the place where people are necessarily going to choose to ride if they're trying to get somewhere. But a lot of people are trying to go to Solano Ave itself, to the stores, to the restaurants, to all the services along there. And we would like bicycling to be an integral part of how people do those things in Albany. So we would really like to see a design as the primary design in the plan be one that encourages that and follows the goals that were stated at the beginning of the plan, as Committee Member Larson pointed out. So I really think that the plan that's shown as the primary design now does not achieve those objectives and should not be designated as the primary design in the plan. Thanks.
Thank you. And briefly before the next member of the public comes up, I wanted to make a motion to extend our meeting time to 9:45. I believe we need to do that since we're at 9:30. And if anyone wants to second that. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. And then whoever next wants to come up.
Button's making noise. Hi, I'm Amy Smolens, also with Albany Strollers and Rollers. I live on a 900 block of Kane, so I'm a half a block from Solano. So, I mean, I was part of some of the discussions and focus groups at for the Complete Streets Plan, and unfortunately, even though the purpose of Complete Streets is to, quote, I'll read it, enable safe access for all users, including pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and transit riders of all ages and abilities, that was just completely ignored, as Mr. Larson saw. You guys all live in Albany. You know that Solano Avenue is our main street. Solano Avenue is where we go to restaurants, we go to the doctor, we go to a movie, we go have a beer, we go, whatever we do. It's where we have everything we want to do. We need to be able to access those businesses and what we need to do by bicycle and hopefully stay out of our cars. Some of the city officials and the people who are working on this draft plan kind of thought they sloughed that off and said, well, we can, if you want to go on Solano on bicycle, you can detour a block off, then go on a parallel street, then detour a block back. That's what they do on San Pablo. This map is small, but the blocks off San Pablo are tiny little blocks. The blocks off Solano would be a completely unreasonable distance to detour off, go back, try to figure out, okay, where am I going? I want to go to Gathering Tribe, so all right, I got to turn left back here. It's completely unreasonable. And I know that most of you, or a lot of you, ride bikes, and you know that when you ride a bike, you're out there and you're smelling things and you're seeing things, and you're like, wow, look at that window, that looks great. I'm going to pull over here. Or, hey, I'm passing the pub. There's someone I know. I'm going to pull over and have a beer or something with them, see what's going on. So part of the experience of riding somewhere on Solano is riding on Solano and being on Solano. It's completely unreasonable to ask someone to detour off our main business corridor, our main corridor where you see people all the time, to do any shopping. That makes no sense. Another point is bike parking. Albany Strollers and Rollers for 7 years has started did the bike rack program, which another small picture, but we co-fund with the businesses. There's 62 bike racks, and actually 4 more are just arriving in the city Public Works Department tomorrow. So we've co-funded 66 of these racks, and these are pictures of bikes with trailer bikes, kiddie seats, everything. Everyone rides on Solano. They do go to Solano on their bikes, so we need to make it safe, and we need to create more bike parking. This plan created more car parking. They mentioned somewhere flex space of bike parking, but there's no specific bike parking. There's no bike corral. There's no bike share location, which we're going to need in the future because Lime Bike went under. We're going to need something, so there's absolutely no creation of any safe or convenient bike access whatsoever. So, this is a failure as far as making it truly a complete street. So I hope you'll recognize that and make it so we can get people out of single-use cars and do what we all want to do and what your body wants to do. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Aaron Frank again, Albany resident. I'd like to echo some of the things that I heard, particularly with respect to parking meters, because I've gone up to Solano at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning and seen the parking spaces full, so people are not shopping there when they're parking. So people are using those parking spots probably. I don't want to speculate who's there, but perhaps we could get some more parking by metering. But that's not the point that I wanted to come speak about. I wanted to refer you to page 23 of the plan, where it states, and this is about trees again, while trees provide many benefits, and this is a quote, while trees provide many benefits, some trees are not appropriate for urban environments and should be removed, especially if dangerous. Removing inappropriate trees often is just code for removing large mature trees. And so I just wanted to speak to the benefits of large mature trees. I missed the full discussion of the green infrastructure program, but most of the benefits that we get from trees come from large canopied trees. And you can't plant a 50-year-old tree just by taking down a mature one and putting up a smaller one. It takes planting a tree and then another half century to get there. So larger trees do have impacts on the sidewalks, but we can repair the sidewalks and keep the trees and maintain some of the values that we're looking for. And so, yes, we're going to have to live with the interaction between trees and sidewalks if we both want to have sidewalks and trees. And the trees provide many benefits. Preston mentioned earlier that people shop more, or they walk more on streets that have trees. Research has shown that people shop more in businesses that are on streets with trees. They provide energy efficiency, all the things that were probably discussed before. We're dealing with the urban heat island effect here, and trees are the most cost-effective way of offsetting that, and that requires living with large trees. The large canopy is what actually does most of the work. So I wanted to draw your attention to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you go to the slide with the cross-section of the street? Is there one with the, Yeah, that one. Basically, I've been looking at this plan a lot and critiquing it a lot, this current plan, and I've been very dissatisfied with it. And just the last couple of days, I found it very instructive to go back to the City of Albany's vision statement for complete streets. And I would recommend that everybody reads it, because in terms of that vision statement, this plan pretty much is a failure. You know, I've tried not to be this harsh in the past, but that's the conclusion I've come to. Basically, the vision statement bases the city's complete street policy on the city-approved climate action plan, on the city-approved active transportation plan. And the vision is, and I'm going to read it, in order to promote public health and reduce the production of greenhouse gases, all transportation improvements in the city of Albany will be planned and implemented to provide safe access for children and adults by walking, biking, and public transit. And if you look at this diagram, it's very interesting. There's an 80-foot right-of-way, 60 feet of paving. That's 75% of this public space is given over to automobile and truck and bus use. Okay, that's 75%, 25% for pedestrians. Now, much better distribution of this space would be about 25% for pedestrians, 25% for active modes of transportation, which would be scooters, bikes, any kind of rolling method of getting up and down the street. I think we can't underestimate the impact that scooters are going to have in terms of safety going up and down the street. We have a really, really great opportunity here to make this a much more accessible street by all sorts of kids, families, people on bikes, elderly people. And the whole goal of complete streets is to make it accessible for people of all ages and abilities. And if you look at this diagram right here, you know, are you going to have families and kids and elderly people on bikes feeling safe riding between a truck or a bus and a backing in car? Or, I mean, basically they are continuing the same diagram. It is exactly the same diagram as we've got right now. And I think it's a failure in terms of complete streets. I'm really disappointed. I think we have to have a much more safe space for cyclists. And what I've been reading is that when cities do that, when they provide safe spaces for cyclists, either cycle tracks or protected bike lanes, that businesses actually do better. So we're missing a really big opportunity here to create a better business model, a better downtown, a better Main Street, getting people out of their cars. It's healthier for everybody, less greenhouse gas. I just don't really, I don't know how we got here without exploring other alternatives. You know, that this is the only design on the table is really disappointing to me. I think it should all be sent back and redesigned, give us an opportunity to have a real complete street design to look at and debate. And then, you know, the other aspect of this is, you know, look at each thing in terms of its climate change impact. This is basically the 20th century status quo. And what we need is a 21st century plan. The other thing that I've been thinking about a lot is the impact of ride sharing, car sharing, bike sharing. You've also got automated vehicles that are coming. And I think the net impact of all this is that there's not going to be as much need for parking. More need for drop-off and pickup zones. You know, so I think there's a real opportunity here to look at a future-oriented plan instead of a backwards-looking plan. The other thing I'm looking at is that we are a 5 to 10 minute bike ride from El Cerrito BART, docking bike stations, scooters, shares. We can get a whole lot of people from BART up and down Solano. I think the goal is to get people moving up and down Solano. It's not coming to Solano from the side streets, it's getting them up and down. The gentleman said parking's full at 8 in the morning. That's because parents are taking their kids to the Y, to school. I mean, if we get those people onto bikes, going to all those things, I think we'd have a much healthier, a much safer city and a much more vibrant downtown. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. And then just another quick motion to move our meeting time back to 10 p.m. Seconded.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. And if there's any more public comment, then I guess we'll move on to committee member comment. Anyone wants to begin?
I guess I'd just jump in. So I didn't really know very much about this before this, came to us, and it took me a while to digest it, and I actually talked to Preston offline just to kind of understand it. And the more I learned about it, the more just horrified I was about this plan. This is our opportunity to take things forward, and our committee is trying to encourage active transportation and a drastic, fast change in our city. And this plan, I asked Preston, so is there a picture of what the current is? And he said, well, it's basically more or less like that. I mean, to me, it was really horrifying that this was the plan that was proposed. So I just wanted to get stuff started off by saying that I totally support either kicking this back or the proposal addition that has the bike lane track. If that's the best that can be done, then that would be, but something has to be done on this.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. So I totally agree with all the points of view that have been presented. I also thought the little switcheroo, I understand they're trying to get the traffic off Key Route a little bit further away from the intersection with Masonic. I've sat there many times and tried to merge in, but I don't think the left, right, left shuffle is going to be any better. I like the idea of kind of developing the park more, but there's some other things coming from the point of view of Climate Action Committee. There's some other things I'd really like to see in the plan too. One is EV charge stations, and I did a little research. The thing that's coming out now that you see a lot of in the UK and Germany, in fact, German companies do this, is they have this thing called a smart cable that you can put with your electric car, and then you can plug it into an outlet, and it'll actually meter, and then via cell phone technology bill you for pulling power off, say, an outlet that's on a street light. So I think we're replacing a lot of the street lights because they've been all deemed inappropriate. So putting in new street lights, why couldn't they all have power plugs for EVs? Get some EV spaces there. That's more attraction to get more people there in EVs, not gas-powered cars. So I think we should have an EV charge station. I can give you some information. It's the city of Lancaster, California has a pilot project where they are doing exactly this. And they're the first one in California. So I think Albany should be the second one. And we should really look into that. The other thing is, someone did bring up metering. I go up to the other end of beyond where we are in Berkeley, and you go up around Pete's and you try to park, and you cannot park to save your life. And it's all metered. You can't park anywhere in those last blocks. Everybody wants to be there. There's all this activity, stuff going on, people sitting on the sidewalk. So it would almost mean to make more sense to reduce the parking and then charge for it so that, more people used other modes of transportation. And I think what we should look at is thinking about at least putting in some sort of infrastructure that anticipates metering. I don't know what it is. Now there are all these standalone things that are charged off solar, so I guess it isn't a big deal to do that. But anyway, that was one thing I was thinking of, is trying to discourage parking and do the rest. And I just can't emphasize enough, being a bike rider myself and going up and down Solano, allow myself to be on Solano, not to travel somewhere. If I'm going somewhere else, I do go up Marin. But being on Solano on a bicycle is really important. And the angled-in parking is just very dangerous, and it's also very dangerous for cars. I've seen a lot of incidents of that happening, and with pedestrians. So anyway, I support the plan that Preston has come up with. I think it can probably be polished and certain other things improved, but having the cycle track is definitely something we should promote in our calling as advising the city council as to what to do about climate action.
I'd like to make a motion, but I do want to hear from any other committee members if they have comments. Any other?
Yeah,
Comments?
I have comments. I agree with what's already been stated. I can't tell whether the consultant addressed one of the safety issues on Solana, which is cars taking U-turns to park in those angle spaces. That's messed me up on my bike many times. It's pretty scary because they're not really seeing the bicycles. So I think we need some kind of, obviously the solid yellow line doesn't do anything. Some bollards or something to prevent cars from doing U-turns. And the other thing is, I think the angle-in parking is inherently dangerous. And I really like Preston's design of having the parallel parking, and I'm wondering if, what would be the impact of increasing that on the north side of Solano, whether that would take out too much parking. But doing it on both sides, we could look at doing something more with the sidewalk, because I walk a lot on Solano, and there's lots of areas where it's single, it's single width person because of either the trees or the landscaping or just the size of the sidewalk. So I didn't see that really changing either, and when I looked at this, I was trying to figure out, what did they change? Not much. I mean, the intersections, it looks like things have changed, but it's not really making it any safer, and that goes against what we're trying to achieve with the Climate Action Plan, to encourage people to get out of their cars. So I'm in favor of rejecting this and supporting Preston's alternative with some additional traffic safety measures and sidewalk improvements.
So I just had a few, hopefully brief comments. I support the Preston plan, for lack of a better word. I'm also very curious about the origin of the current plan, because it just seems like it's rather meeting a very poor reception. So I'm just wondering, I mean, I think, we're trying to work with the consultant for the CAP 2.0, so hopefully there won't be a big surprise when that product is unveiled. So I'm just curious about, we don't have to answer that now, but it's kind of surprising to me. But just a few brief comments. One thing that I think one of the gentlemen mentioned was planning for a 21st century future and not a 20th century or 1950s future with increasing car travel. So I think that's very appealing to me, the prospect of more ride sharing or more scooters, perhaps electric powered. So if there's a way to provide optionality within the plan so that there can be less parking or less pavement even, more green spaces. And so I think the opportunity to couple this with what Stephanie just presented on green infrastructure is another opportunity. It could be bioswales, water, just something very attractive and aesthetic through trees and shade and, a different kind of vision for Solano. Toward that end, I really love the concept of closing off Solano several times a year and just having there's dinner with Albany, but doing that more than once per year.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it kind of ties into that. So those are just a few thoughts.
Great. Well, then I'd like to make a motion. Oh, you have an additional comment?
But maybe beyond the little scope, but the other little note that I made to myself is that this is like a once in a couple decades kind of opportunity.
Absolutely.
And Lower Solano has done a fabulous job with making a prettier city. And this is an opportunity. I am so disappointed that this doesn't have any beautification. Your comments about the trees, yeah, more trees. It's like, cafe space on the sidewalks. Lower Solano is revitalized because it's catering to people who want to live in this kind of, walkable, accessible city. And Mid Solano, I think, absolutely needs that. So I would love to see this plan revised.
Is there possibility to include like a designated bike lane on Solano, or is that not really part of the plan?
That is part of the alternative plan. So with that, and in light of the time, and thank you to everyone, thank you so much for your vigilance and participation and bringing this to this committee's attention. So I'd like to make a motion that from the Climate Action Committee, that we recommend council to reject the draft plan, to revise it to be in sync with the Complete Streets vision, with the active transport plan, and with the climate action plan, incorporating the recommendations that have been made by multiple members of the public.
All in favor?
Well,
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
I didn't get a chance to add my thing on an EV, but anyway, that's okay.
Including EV.
And then that completes all of our discussion and possible action items. If we want to talk briefly about future agenda items, if there's any comments for that.
We're bringing you the work plan in April, and we'll have a CAP strategy discussion. And one question for you, the CAP strategy discussion is going to be a very meaty discussion. Is there any interest and/or are you available to meet earlier? And if so, how much earlier? If you'd like to have, a one-time meeting earlier here. This meeting, but have an earlier start time if people are available.
That's a bit of an issue for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So 7:30 is the earliest you can be here?
Yeah, probably around 7 or 7:30. However, I could just come at that time, and I would be okay with the meeting starting earlier.
I mean, I wouldn't want anyone to miss out.
Yeah.
What do you guys think?
Fine with starting earlier
Yeah.
for that one meeting.
Okay. How much earlier?
I can make it at 6, but I know that other people have work and.
Yeah.
6:30.
6:30?
Yeah,
Looks fine.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So we'll plan for 6:30, and Allison will come when you can?
Yeah.
Okay.
Quick question, Claire. When you said that the subcommittee should get each other on our calendars, are we doing that on our own, or does staff have to coordinate that?
The staff won't coordinate these meetings, so yeah, you can go meet at Fonda's and get a cocktail.
This is the 24th?
No, sorry, this is the subcommittee meetings to talk about strategies. So staff will send you information about the
Good.
strategies, and you
Yeah.
will.
So you'll send
But
something,
you'll
who's on
coordinate.
what.
We'll
Yeah,
set
then
out
we'll
who's
co-
on what, but you'll coordinate with each other.
That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, we can email you tomorrow with that information.
We have one last.
Quick comment on future agenda. You may be aware that the number of new build housing proposals that are coming into Albany has increased dramatically. And I think there's a need, and I think you received a message earlier on the need to prohibit natural gas in new building construction. Berkeley's actually moving rapidly in that direction. I had a presentation, I'll share it offline. But in the last 3 months, there have been as many new housing units in new build construction proposed in Albany as the previous 3 years. And that's probably because the parking policy has changed. So each of those buildings that comes in and applies is under the current code, and that becomes a fixed pollution source because they're going to have natural gas in them. So I encourage you to move in parallel to the development of the climate action plan rather than waiting until it's done to take this up. So please put it on your agenda. Berkeley's goal is to adopt this ordinance so that it goes into effect January 1st, 2020, which is when the new building and energy codes go into effect. So they can all go into effect simultaneously. And I would hope that you would have the same goal. Thank you.
Thanks. And then with that, our meeting's adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.